And there's a, okay. Yes, I had a reminder from someone to record. Thank you to that person. The question comes up to me, do we have to teach to the CCR standards? And the answer is yes. Under WIOA, which is our federal law, we must align our adult ed system to K-12 standards. Now, at the time in 2014, when the standards came out, most states were going with the Common Core standards. Times have changed a little bit. Of course, we're going to be seeing some new English language arts standards for K-12 coming up soon. We still have the CCRS, TIF, and North Star. Those are our statewide standards as chosen by our MDE team. And our programs need to document how those standards are at play in instruction through the 5-year narrative, which is something that your program might be in this year. You might have gone through it last year, but this is something where programs kind of have to do a deep dive and they have to document all kinds of things from intake processes to the classes that are being taught to professional development that the staff is doing. And this goes to our MDE team to determine if you will continue as a program. So in Minnesota, we have the Blue Book. And I say that in Minnesota because the Blue Book is the key book. However, there's also this red book you can see down on the lower left, the English Language Proficiency Standards for Adult Education. And if any of you are working with the CASA steps, you will see alignment to the ELPS standards. And that is the red book. However, the red book is not a separate set of standards to be used as such. The blue book is the goal for all students. The red book was created to help kind of distill the standards and give some guidelines about language lifts that English learners will need in order to do the work of the blue book. So the red book is available, and it can be helpful, but we made a decision in 2017 that all students have the capacity to do the blue book. Certainly, students are going to need different supports depending on where their readiness skills are. Regardless, we have NRS level descriptors. If you don't know what those are, you do know that you place students at functioning levels, whether it's ESL 1 beginning ESL or high adult secondary, which is ABE 6. Those levels all have very detailed descriptors that say what students should be able to do when they exit those levels. Built on that are our CASAS and TABE assessments. They work with those level descriptors and the standards to determine where those cut scores are to make a level gain. And of course, curriculum and resources are aligned for the CASAS and the TABE, but they're also aligned to the standards. One thing I do want to note before we go any further is you will have access to this slide deck. And I will also give you access to a Padlet where there are lots of things we're going to talk about today. So at your own pace, you can go through, you can look at some of the resources. And so that way you don't have to scramble to take any kind of notes or anything unless you want to take some general notes because you will have access to all of this. So we're going to talk about the shifts. We talk about the shifts because this is really a key way to get to the English language arts standards. In the beginning, we thought we would go through, all of us would just go through our curriculum or what we were teaching, and we would match the standards to what we were doing. But something we noticed is we weren't making some of the kind of fundamental changes to our teaching that we wanted to make. So we come at it through the shifts. How am I working with each shift? And the answers to those questions or lack of answers to those questions really help to guide us in the decisions we're going to make. You're going to have opportunities to unmute and chat definitely use the chat box. Again, this is just a very quick review because some of you are new. There are 4 ELA strands. One is reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. In addition, in the Blue Book, after the 4 strands, we have what are called the Reading Standards Foundational Skills. And those are the standards that focus on alphabetics and fluency. So if you are working with learners who are just developing a concept of print, or they are working on the alphabet, or they are learning how to recognize and decode simple words in text, you're working on the foundational skills in the standards. Obviously, students can't do much without alphabetics and fluency. One thing to note is students do not need to master these foundational skills. They do not need any kind of mastery level of alphabetics or fluency to work on the other standards. And we'll talk a little bit about it's going to look very different from if you're teaching the GED level of these standards or if you are teaching beginning English learners. So complexity is really about the kind of text we're using with students and also academic language and how we're working with vocabulary. Evidence is when we ask students to go back to the text, whatever text we're using, and when they're talking, they are using evidence from text, they're writing using evidence from text, and then knowledge. Building knowledge around a topic or an essential question and kind of going deep. None of these things, none of these shifts need to be done 100% of the time, every moment of instruction. So, for example, for complexity, we're going to talk about how you want to use a range of texts. You want to use texts that are well within the range of your students, but you also want to stretch them sometimes with support. And so we just want to keep in mind kind of the whole of what we're doing and the balance that we're striking. So let's walk through one ELA standard because when you look at one of these anchor standards, it's huge. And this is really the outcome. When students graduate from high school, they're all supposed to be at level E of the standards. I don't think they are, realistically, but just looking at Anchor 1, this is one of the key standards. If you take a look, students need to read closely. They need to determine what the text says explicitly, make logical inferences, cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions. Now, you might be working with students who are, say, ESL 1, and you think, how in the world are my students going to do this anchor? Well, they're going to do this part of the anchor. They're going to be doing foundational work. And if you are working with ESL 1, 2, 3, and I believe ABE 1, so I think up through high beginning ESL and beginning basic education, your students are working on being able to ask and answer questions about details. They may be checking yes or no. They may be checking true or false. They may be going up to an image on a smart board and they may be pointing to what the evidence is for their yes or no answer. And that's what they're doing then. That's important foundational work. If you're working with B, and there is a chart on the Padlet that will let you know if you're not sure where your students are, they're getting into the 5Ws plus H questions. Again, they're working on key details. They're just learning how to find some direct answers to these questions. They can also be doing very simple inferencing or more complex inferencing. They are adults. C, now they're starting to refer to specific details and examples in the text, and they're starting to quote from the text. Level D, and level D is low adult secondary. Or, I'm sorry, no, level D is high intermediate, ABE, and advanced ESL. Now these students are supposed to be applying these skills to reading primary and secondary sources, which is very common for those of us working with high school equivalency, or they're reading texts that are more science oriented or technical, anything having to do with the natural sciences or social sciences. And then finally, at level E, which is low adult secondary and high adult secondary, students are really citing strong and thorough textual evidence. If you have students who are doing the standard adult diploma, they have to write an essay, they have to do in-text citations, they have to have references according to MLA or APA, and that's the top of the anchor. The question that you need to ask yourself is, where are your students on this journey? Where are your students on this journey? Go ahead and put in the chat box so I can get some sense here. What are the levels of students that you're teaching? I'm trying to keep all of these things on one screen. What are the levels of the students you're teaching? And if you are in a one-room schoolhouse and you do it all, then go ahead and put that as well. Okay, Shelley, A through E. Vonda, levels 1 and 2. AB, Lori, all. Heather, yes, you do support teachers there in Minneapolis. Advanced beginning. All right, so maybe high beginning. All. Wow. Yeah. So some of you are definitely working at the lower end of these standards, and it's going to look different, but it's no less the work of the standards. Any questions before we move in? Again, I'm trying to adjust all of my stuff here. And you can certainly unmute. There aren't so many of us that you can't unmute and ask a question. Actually, before that, if someone would like to unmute, or a few of you, how do you choose texts for your students? How do you choose texts, and how do you know that they are appropriate for the students that you're working with? You can certainly put in the chat box, or you can unmute. How do you choose the texts you use, and how do you know that they're appropriate? Christine says TABE scores, GED practice. Yep, so you're gathering information about students' readiness. Others.
I will unmute and say I work with lower level ESL learners. It's very difficult to find lower level texts for adults. So a lot of what I will do is take something that I've used. I also teach elementary age. So I might take something from that if it seems like I can adapt it to more of an adult level, or I make up my own and then we just go from there. Or articles, things like that. It's so hard to find lower level for adult readers.
And I
So,
think there are people on this call or on this Zoom webinar who are probably thinking, oh yeah, been there, done that, trying to find lower level. And of course, it's better than it was even 10 years ago, but there's still a lot to be desired to find a good low level text that's actually interesting.
yeah.
To adults, did anyone want to comment on that? Or I'm looking at the chat box at some other answers. I see interest, absolutely, giving students agency to express, things that they're interested in. I think that's a really important part. ReadWorks, ELE, for those of you who aren't familiar with ELE, the prior ESL library, it is now being paid for by the state, by Minnesota Adult Education, and it goes all the way to for beginning ESL, all the way up through. Boy, I would say that you could use content from ELE even if you're working with lower, high, intermediate adult ed pre-GED students. Weekly themes, good. Yeah, we have scores, right? We have intake scores that we get, whether it's CASA steps or goals or TABE. And that gives us a little snapshot of where a student is with comprehension, and a silent comprehension score. But it is a place to start. Text is everything. Everything. And text can be very traditional. Text can be a prescription on a bottle, a medicine bottle. It can be a cartoon. It can be song lyrics, if any of you use song lyrics when working with literacy. It can be a brochure. It can be an excerpt from a novel. It can be all of these things and more. So text is anything that students can read technically. You can read a photograph, you can read a video, you can obviously read a billboard or a sign. So when we talk about text complexity, what do we mean by that? So I actually, if you haven't seen the Min ABE Connect newsletter, I have an article in there today. For a long time, we've used Lexile. And if you are in the K-12 system, Lexile is very familiar to you. Minnesota just ended its partnership with Lexile in terms of offering teachers the premium subscription for free. So we can no longer use Lexile as a measure for free. That's okay. We've got another one, ATOS, that is recommended by the College and Career Readiness Standards. But what do we mean? Well, quantitative is one part. So if you are using a textbook, say Ventures 1, okay, Ventures 1 has a target of adult learners and educational functioning levels. That doesn't mean that all of those texts are going to be appropriate for all of the students. Some might be easy, some might be more difficult, but a computer measures quantitative. We measure qualitative. Qualitative is complexity that computers cannot measure. And this is really important if you are using AI, say you're using ChatGPT or Magic School or Diffit to relevel texts. The way that AI relevels texts is the same way that computers measure texts. They play with the sentence length, they play with um, um, adding simple headings, repeating words, shortening paragraphs. But the computer doesn't play with the level of vocabulary or the text structures or the themes or literary devices or things that make things really complex. That's for our eyes to measure. And then reader and task is, do my students even really want to read this? We might have a piece of text and we might say, this is great. This is exactly appropriate. And then you might think, but I don't know that anyone really actually is interested in this or wants to read it, or this doesn't really connect to anybody's goal. And then you say, I'm not going to use it. At any point here, you can toss the text, or you can say, I'm going to use it for something different. I'm not going to use it. This isn't going to work for us to go through and dig deep into, understanding the text, but it sure would make a good text to practice fluency. There is no single source of information. Um, Publishers say this is the level of the text. It goes much farther than that or further than that, because There are novels that only adults would read, like John Grisham novels, that actually Lexile at a second grade. And for books that have a lot of dialogue, the computer algorithms recognize those as short sentences, and they say, "Oh yeah, this is about a second grade." When we wouldn't use the text for that group of second graders, certainly. So, a couple key things here. When you are going to close read, okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. That is a one kind of reading, one kind of purpose where students are going to read and reread a text and they're going to dig into it and they're going to work on vocabulary and they're going to do a first read and a second read and they're going to make inferences and they're going to look at how the writer, organized the writing. That's close reading. And then we do want to look very carefully at the text we're using. First and foremost, to make sure it's rich enough to make it worth the student's while to reread. If you are teaching level A, again, beginning, low beginning, and high beginning ESL, you're using something that's not print, you're using poetry or an excerpt from a short story or a novel, skip the computer. The computer can't measure it. That's for your eyes. You need to decide. Literature it cannot be analyzed by tools like Lexile simply because um, these algorithms don't measure meaning. So there is an anchor, CCRS Reading Anchor 10, and it looks different from any other anchor in the ELA standards. It's a chart. And over time, most of the chart, it told us quantitative measures we could use that researchers behind the CCRS kind of went deep and determined these were really accurate in different ways. So all you see here is ATOS. ATOS works like Lexile. ATOS works, some of you may have used Flesch Kincaid, for example, that's built into Microsoft Word. There's all these numbers, but they aren't necessarily grades. So when you see 2.75, that doesn't necessarily mean three-quarters of the way through second grade. These are ranges. Notice there's nothing for CCRS level A because it's all complex. And most of the time, there isn't enough text to measure. So we need to expose our students to a range. So if I am working with students who are in that level B, I need to be using texts across instruction that range from probably pretty easy at the bottom, 2.75, up to what's going to be pretty challenging. It's important to note that range. It's also important to note the overlap. You'll see that at the top of level B, the ATOS score is a little bit higher than the bottom of level C. Well, if we want our students to make level gains, we're going to have to be exposing students who are on the higher end of our groups. We're going to have to be making sure that they are having experience with texts that are moving into the next CCRS level. Because that's what the designers of tests like the TABE and the CASAS test do. They decide this is a text that really the student needs to be in the next functioning level to answer. So we want to make sure it's about balance. Now, I'm going to open this up here. Who here has been using AI? It doesn't matter what AI you've been using, and you've been using it to differentiate a bit with your text, to lower or increase the level of text. Go ahead and unmute. How have you been using it and how has it been working? Anybody?
My son made a program for me that
Your
was
son just made a program?
yeah, he's really good at computers. He's a computer science degree and
Wow.
he's a software engineer. And I had this the job I had last year. I was supporting social studies, and I'm thinking just in case. And so I use it for a few students, but I didn't use it a lot, and it ended up being $20 a month for the chat, the subscription. So I discontinued that, but I do have a program, and if I if I need to use it again, he made it where you download. It has to be like you have to copy the script or
Mhm.
the document, then put it into the system and tell what lexile you want. And it
Mhm.
also gives you a voice to choose from if you want it to be read to you. So
Okay.
it's a really nice program. And but I've used it a few times, but then since I wasn't using it like all the time, I discontinued the $20 per month. But I started new.
Okay. And a lot of us are in those early stages of doing this and learning. I know that I've been talking a lot to Elizabeth Bennett, who's our state digital literacy coordinator. She's been playing with a lot of different AI to create texts and to relevel texts and kind of finding and working out some of the bugs so that, we can offer some good advice. I see. I I'm not sure how to pronounce your first name. I know who you are. Is it Cimarron or Cimarron? I know you can't say anything because you're in a shared office, but if you could, Cimarron. Thank you so much. Cimarron, you used it to differentiate Indigenous Peoples Day readings. All right. So, and how did that, if you can chat in the chat box, how did that work? Did that work pretty well? While she's typing, anybody else doing anything with AI to play with the levels of text or even the levels of questions? Simran says a lot of revising. Absolutely. And that's why I have on here. We need to tread carefully. We're still learning a lot. We need to check text if we're not certain. Eyeballing text only works so well. We can drop it in something like Atos, and I've got directions for you to do that. We've got to look at those qualitative features. Okay, so we have to look at sentence complexity. We have to look at the background knowledge that is assumed that a student has. You've got on here, Simran, vocabulary was appropriate, but the ideas were complex. So there again, at first glance, you might say, oh, I think my students can handle the vocabulary, but there may be some other aspects of the text that students are going to need support. If you're like me, you may have taken a text and changed it a little bit. If any of you have done that, please go ahead and put that in the chat box. You may have played with the sentences. You may have replaced vocabulary with perhaps easier synonyms to try to reduce the complexity of a text. And there is a role for that, depending on what we're using our text for. However, just changing some things, especially when it's the numbers game, doesn't automatically make the text more comprehensible. It can actually ramp up the complexity. Some of the teachers I've worked with have noticed this with News ELA if you use it. You can choose different lexile levels, but sometimes teachers have said when we start trying to use a lower lexile level, it just seems like there's like bigger gaps or connections that students have to make. And I see her, thanks, Mark. Word frequency to pre-teach a text. Excellent. Find cognates. Excellent. Good. These are great ways to use it. When we simply simplify, to be redundant there, the linguistic features of a text, we can remove important elements. And this is a great example of that. So this might be a sentence that you think, well, this is a pretty long sentence. Depending on the level of learner, this could be a tough sentence. It's a complex sentence. We've got because. the subordinating conjunction. We've got, we've got a lot of prepositional phrases. What AI might do is the simplified text below that. So now we have Paco had to make money for his family. Paco worked at night. He often went to sleep in class. Now this would fall at a lower Lexile level. What's the difference? Have we lost anything? And go ahead and unmute. What's the difference between the original and the simplified text?
There's no because, so you don't see the cause.
And what does, right, right, because gives us a cause. Paco looks really different or sounds very different in these two sentences. In the first sentence, Paco is working because, or he's falling asleep in class because he's working at night. In the simplified text, he's making money, he's working at night, he often went to sleep in class. There is a jump that students need to make. There's an inference that students need to make. And it isn't that we don't want them to make inferences like that from just a little bit of information. But certainly, depending on the level of students you're working with, more explicit is going to be better. So the original text, even though you may have to put it up and maybe take it apart as a group, like take it apart grammatically to understand it, it has the original intent of the writer. So notes about level A text when you're working in the very, very beginning, they're all complex because these students are still learning the very basics of reading. And if you encounter texts that are over 100 words, I would measure those texts because they're probably actually what would be considered a CCRS level B text. Again, it doesn't mean you don't use them. It just means that students might need additional support. And level A, again, are these functioning levels. So it's ESL 1, 2, and 3, and ABE, beginning ABE literacy. So basically, students who are just learning the building blocks of alphabetics it's all going to be complex. And we have something called productive struggle. What's productive struggle? There's enough of you on here who have this is a little bit of a review for what do we mean by productive struggle?
I work with elementary kids, and that means that they have to work kind of hard to, they might have to sound out words, they might have to stop and think, how does it relate to something that I already know? But then when they've completed their reading and they realize, they kind of go, yeah, I did it. So that's what I think productive struggle.
Yeah, those are some great examples. And yeah, that feeling of self-efficacy it's really, really powerful. Somebody else, productive struggle. Can you give me an example I know we're only in the second week of school, but can you give me, for back in the fall, can you give me an example of how you encourage productive struggle in your classroom with your adult learners?
I think I encourage productive struggle when I ask one student to teach another student or help another
Okay.
student. It really is like, okay, do you really understand this concept?
Okay, so possibly pairing a higher level student with a student who needs more support. Okay. I give time to think through. Vicky Larson, have you gotten really good at that? I was terrible at wait time for for a while. How do you ensure that you give some time? Something that's, well, what are some of the challenges? If you stop and you wait so that a student has a chance to think, what can happen with the rest of the class? other students like to help. And it comes from a good place, right? Struggle is not easy. And when a student is thinking and we're giving time, many times another student will jump in with the answer. And so we have to kind of um, create the culture of productive struggle sometimes with our students, so that they rely on themselves, each other, resources, instead of just, going to the teacher or asking us giving them or guiding them too much to the right answer. I would often tell my students, some people think really, really fast, and some people need to reflect. They need to think a little bit. And we have to give everybody an opportunity to come up with an answer. So life is full of productive struggle, and adults, regardless of what they are working with in our classrooms, they are engaging with complex texts in their everyday lives, whether at work, whether something that they're seeing in the newspaper, whether it's a form that they have to fill out, it's something health information, something online, telehealth, something coming home from the school. Productive struggle is this zone of proximal development. I hadn't thought about that in years when I started thinking about this again. But productive struggle is a sweet spot in between no struggle and unnecessary struggle. Struggle can be difficult. We don't want our students to struggle. We want our students to experience success. Of course we do. But there's a difference between unnecessary struggle and productive struggle. Productive struggle means we are giving them the tools, the strategies to make something out of what they're working on. We are having them work collaboratively. We are using graphic organizers. We are pre-teaching vocabulary. We're doing things so that they can engage in this productive struggle. They have so many texts in real adult life that they may struggle with. We want them to have some of this productive struggle with us when they're with us in the classroom, and we are there to provide supports and peers are there to provide supports. That's where we want to stretch them. That's where the most learning gains happen, according to research. I like to think of it as instructional plus one. Now, for those of us who trained on independent reading level, instructional level, and frustration level, that feels instructional plus one might not feel very comfortable. But in reality, we have to move away at times from the independent instructional and frustration levels, because a lot of that is not actually rooted in research. And also, we cannot be afraid to stretch our students into texts that they need additional help with. That is where reading gains happen. And we don't do it all the time. And we may have an entire lesson where only one part of it puts students in productive struggle. We don't want them to be in productive struggle all the time. So if you look at these qualitative features of text, what do you think are the two most complex features of text for our students, where they tend to struggle the most? I'm sorry, the one. Which of these is the one that creates the most complexity? They can all present complexity for our students, but one is more than any other. Okay, Mark, thank you. Purpose or text structure? Oh, purpose sure can be complex, especially if it's not explicit. Text structure, sure. Especially if we've been working on, say, one text structure at a time, and then we give students something where there are 4 different text structures in the one text. Background, absolutely. Lots of studies about how important background knowledge is to be able to connect new learning to. Christine, I see that you said that the challenges of AI on NPR this morning, a possible downside, it will remove the struggle. Yeah, yeah, AI, boy, there's a lot of different ways we could go in the future, and some teachers I know are not using it at all. Some teachers I know are using it a lot. Some programs that I know are like forbidding anyone from using it. I mean, everybody's in a different place. Language features typically cause the most complexity. That doesn't mean in every single text, but complex sentences and uncommon or unknown vocabulary tend to be a really big area of complexity. And to the extent where when I was teaching, sometimes we would be reading something and we would encounter a sentence that was particularly complex. Maybe because it was long, maybe because of the language structures that were in that sentence. And I would actually take some time to put that sentence up on the whiteboard, put it on the screen, or put it on my smart board. And we would take it apart and we would do a close read of that sentence. And we would use our knowledge of grammar, use our knowledge of language conventions in order to be able to kind of make meaning of that sentence. Mark, yes, figurative language. Wow. Figurative language. Lexile, Atos, they're Flesh Kincaid, they're not paying any attention to figurative language. So that is something that we have to be sure that we know. There is a wonderful rubric. Some of you may remember the rubric where we had to get into groups and we talked, is something simple, simply moderately, very, or exceedingly complex. And a lot of the conversations turned into, it became more about the rubric and less about the actual work. So we would debate, do we think there are several instances of outside references or only some instances? This is it really very complex or is it exceedingly complex? And we got really caught up in a lot of the language on the rubric. I created something for myself that I have on the Padlet. Look, it's either not complex or there's some potential complexity. So when we talk about, and I combine the graphics into text structure, background knowledge, it's either practical knowledge, everyday knowledge that everyone knows something about, or it's not. It either has no references to outside ideas or it has one or more. Students are either familiar with the feature, they're familiar with, say, how to read a prescription. They're familiar with how to read a job application. They know it's going to ask for their name. They know it's going to ask for their address. They know it's going to ask for work experience. The purpose is either very explicit or it's possibly going to be complex. The text structure either makes very clear connections. The text features, they're there. Whether or not students use them doesn't really matter. Follows a common genre. So if it's narrative, students know there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. If there's a flashback, now that's going to be something maybe that you need to work with the students on. Graphics are great. They're pretty. They're nice, but they're not essential. And the language features, the language is literal, clear, it's conversational. The vocabulary load as you look at it is very light, and the sentence structures are very simple. Anything beyond this, there's complexity that's present. Maybe it will be complex for your group. Maybe it won't be complex for your group. It depends on their readiness. It depends what you've done up to this point, what they already know. But it just means we need to give it some thought about how we might support students into unpacking that particular complexity. And then when it's all done, we ask ourselves, would our students even be motivated to read this text, or to listen to this text or look at this text? Do they have the background knowledge necessary? Does it connect to anything? What have been their prior experiences so far in this class? Wow, this would have been a really difficult text to read about the Bill of Rights, but we've been working on concepts of the Bill of Rights. And we've already done some work and built some vocabulary. It's actually not going to be that complex. The purpose, what are you asking students to do? You can have a complex text and ask them to do a fairly simple task. You can take a simple text and ask them to do a fairly complex task. So we have to think about that. And at this point, you might say, I'm still not going to use this text. So what I would like you to do is we're just going to take a few minutes here and I'm going to give you a couple options. I am going to um, drop this in the chat box. If you look at the chat box, the first thing is this particular scaffolding sheet here that you see. I just dropped a link to a Google Drive. I will also upload it if you want to click on it on your computer. You can also just read it on the screen if you want to read something that small. Hold on, I'm just finding them. So you can click on the one in the chat box to go to the Google Drive. You can look at it on the screen. You can click on the PDF file. But I want to take just a few minutes. I want you to look and ask yourself, what is a scaffold here that you use regularly? And what is one that you think, actually, you know what? I think I'd like to try that. Or I've done that, but not for a long time, and I think I want to try that again. So let's just take a few minutes to think on your own about these two questions. I'm gonna give you about 30 more seconds. I want to keep us on time here. Stop us there. So would somebody like to unmute and either um, talk briefly about a scaffold that's on here that you use regularly and that you find works very effectively, or about one that catches your eye and you might want to try? Shelley, providing sentence or paragraph frames. Yeah. Fill in the blank activities when speaking or writing. Images, absolutely. Images are so great in so many ways to activate prior knowledge. Yep, lots of great pre-reading things here, Mark calls out. Pre-teaching vocabulary, Susan, you do that. Vicky, you use a lot of translanguaging, cognate recognition. Sure. Good. Heather's getting all fancy here in the chat box. Pre-reading, during reading, post-reading. Yeah. A lot of times we do pre-reading activities and post-reading, but we don't necessarily do a lot when students are reading. And there's a lot of opportunities there. Translanguaging. Yeah, translanguaging is something that we're still uh, starting to talk a lot about, but how to leverage students' home language in the classroom to actually make connections to learn English. And that is definitely a scaffold that we can use as long as we're using it as a tool. Any other comments or questions about these? And there are more than these. These are just ones that you can find in the literature. They're ones that I've used or a lot of the teachers that I work with or the reading specialists recommend. Any comments? Writing a gist. Now, Christine, is that something that you do currently or something that you would like students to do?
I
I'm thinking.
have done it in the past, do it currently. But I just see it as another bullet point for under the examples of post-reading scaffolds.
Yes, and I'm going to add that to that handout. If anyone's done, there's some great kind of graphic organizers out there for getting the gist, where students can there's blanks, up to 20 blanks, and they have to decide something that is a really good activity, especially if you have mixed like groups. You have students who need more support with students who maybe need less support. The conversation of a small group or a pair, kind of deciding what those 20 words or phrases should be, is really productive conversation. Many times, students who need more support, who can hear the students who are maybe at the higher end of that group talk about which words or phrases they think are most important. That conversation is really important and can help in itself be a scaffold for students who need it. That productive conversation. I love to dig into juicy sentences. I loved that. And when my class began to be more English learners towards the last maybe 5 or 6 years of my teaching, about 3/4 of my GED prep class were English learners. They really enjoyed that, taking apart and looking at it from a language point of view and really looking at the language conventions. They liked that a lot. And that is necessary. Students need to be able to apply their knowledge of grammar, of usage, of mechanics to comprehend better. And high utility vocabulary. Yep, it can't just be there. We have to work with it. And academic vocabulary really starts with low intermediate ESL. When we really want to explicitly be working with it. But before that, of course, there's all kinds of high utility words, very common, the most common words in English that students need to be using. We can pre-teach vocab related to key ideas. Other words, just tell them what it means. There are words that they're going to encounter in text, and we want them to be curious about words, but we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about a word perhaps that they're maybe never even going to see again. We run into that with literature sometimes. It's okay to say this is what the word means, and let's go on. And we want to look for those words that have multiple meanings, that students know it one way. They might know just offhand. I always use this example. They might know what novel means in terms of reading a novel, but then they see something that is a sentence with a novel idea for using AI, and now they are not sure what novel means. And tiers, the course gets more into this. They're tier 1 words. Those are those first words that we learn when we're learning a language that I still remember in all the languages that I studied. And then we have the tier 3. Those are very specific to a content area or to a career. They're best learned, contextualized. And then we have the tier 2 words. These are words that appear across context, and they're less common in speech. We tend to use more conversational words. But Just even from precise, analyze, imply, these are often words that are in directions and often in test questions. When students aren't quite ready to be engaging in explicit instruction about tier 2 words, start using them orally. Oral language is an essential bridge to reading and writing, and we can start building foundations early on. So again, that orange, those tier 2 words. And when we are going to pre-teach, we want to consider words that are in a text, but also words that might be in the tasks we're asking them to do. We want to consider how we might work with those students first in pre-teaching our language. Any questions? And I'm going to give you a 5-minute stretch break here. Any questions? I am just finding, wasn't sure where the break was going to be, so I'm grabbing that really quick. 5-minute stretch break. Any questions before you? All right. Well, you can certainly stay and ask me a question. You can put it in the chat box and show your face. Great. Who else is back? While we're waiting for people to come back, I know this is something that sometimes we ask, on webinars, or it's like an icebreaker, but I think it's always worth asking since some of us are just back into the new school year. What is a little tiny success you already had this school year? It might be a success with, a lesson that you've done, or a success that a student has had that you're excited about. It can be something small. You can go ahead and unmute. Danielle says Ellie videos. Yeah, I think it's going to be my issue, if you could even call it an issue, when it used to be the former ESL library, was there was just so much there. Like, there was so much content to use. Somebody else. Something. It's already been good. A new routine, Vicky, breathing, centering time. Yeah, I'm hearing more about some of that from my colleague Andrea Eckelberger, how important some of that work is. A joyful student. Anybody else as you're coming back? A moment of success that you've had since most of us have been back after Labor Day? Or are we already feeling like we're a few weeks in and we're tired? All right. Well, thank you. New routines are great. Routines are so helpful. I found routines particularly helpful when I did have to be absent. My students knew some of the routines so well that it was very easy for the sub. More students returned than expected. That's excellent, Allison. Julia, students looking forward to meeting their teachers. Yeah, until I left the classroom a few years ago, I still got just as excited to go back to school after Labor Day. Even when we had summer school, there was just something really, I don't know, exciting that I never kind of grew out of. All right, well, we are going to move from the break. And we are going to talk about employing evidence, which is the second shift. And whether you are working one-on-one with a student who's preparing for the GED, and you're going through some practice questions and you're asking the student, okay, so why do you think this is the answer? Why is A not the answer. And the student has to go back and say, well, the text says this, whatever. That's evidence. That's one-on-one evidence. You may have students who are highlighting evidence in the text, or they are, talking about what they just read or what they just heard, and they're using some sentence stems or frames to say, well, evidence for what I think is, and then they're actually, giving evidence. Why? It's a hugely important skill. And it really, again, it isn't just career, it isn't just college. Um, so many things. Communication, problem solving, reasoning, research, whether you're researching to buy a new refrigerator or you're researching something for school, all of these skills are in the CCR standards, and evidence is really important for that. So, what are real life examples? What are some actual real life examples where students have to provide evidence? They have to, it's got to be more than just what they think or their opinion on something. Where are times they have to provide evidence? You can unmute or you can put it in the chat box. Court. Absolutely. Pointing to the evidence. Yeah, hold that thought, Heather. Proof of purchase. Yeah, good. What else? Where we have to provide some evidence. Sure, debating a topic. Maybe you're on social media. Career credentials, job interviews. They want to hear evidence of your past skills and successes. Good. There are lots and lots of instances where we need to give some kind of evidence, and some of them you called off this list. Proof of income residence, good. These are great. If they're a citizen, yep. Renewing a driver's license or a passport, absolutely. Especially for people who are getting, if they're getting the enhanced ID, a passport or the real ID. I felt like I had to produce more to get my real ID than evidence I had to produce that I should be able to graduate from college after 4 years. It's so much evidence. Um, Safety incident reports at work. We talked about job interviews, asking for a promotion or raise. I would talk to my students and I'd say, well, they'd say, well, I think I should get more money. So, well, what are you going to, if you're going to go talk to your boss, what are you going to say? Well, I'm going to say, I think I deserve more money. And I'm like, well, what evidence are you going to give for that? I still see more coming in supports. Sure. SNAP, childcare, disability. Talking to a landlord, advocating for children at school and things happening in the community, doctor visits, insurance claims, completion of a drug rehab program. Yeah, our students have a lot of or a lot of times when they need to produce some kind of evidence. So we want to develop that skill. And Reading Anchor 1 asks students to read closely. This is the same anchor that we talked about with the where are you with the standard. What does it mean to read closely? It's a kind of reading. It's not a kind of reading that we do all the time. Well, when we close read, we're really picking something apart. We're looking at what the text just says. What does it say? What is the gist? What is the who, what, where, when, why, and how? Layer 2 is asking questions about craft and structure. We might ask questions about vocabulary or figurative language or why a writer chose a particular word, or is this problem solution? Is it, which of the paragraphs has a cause and effect pattern? What is what do we think is the writer's purpose, or the purpose behind this video or documents? And then the third layer, what does the text mean? So we can draw some more in-depth inferences, maybe connect to other texts. We can take a look at maybe the argument or the persuasive techniques. And the idea is that we start with the key ideas and details when we close read. Everybody kind of gets the lay of the land. And then as students become more familiar with the text, we talk about it more, we dig into it more, they're able to do higher level thinking about that text. So whereas a layer 3 question might be really hard for students. I had a colleague and I looked at a question, a short essay question he had for his GED students. And I said, wow, I said, that question, that's a big question. That really requires some thinking. And he said, this isn't the first question I'm giving them. He said, this is after, we've done some work, we've worked on some vocabulary, we've had some discussions, we've built some knowledge. Now they're ready for it. And so again, when we unpack a text, if we're doing a close reading, which is a different kind of reading than reading to practice fluency or reading for pleasure, or reading to be exposed to a new idea or to build background knowledge. Again, what does the text say? How does it work? What does the text mean? We can do this with videos. We can do this with visuals. We're looking at an image. What does the image say? Like, what do you think the big idea here is of the image? And then how do we know that? How does the photographer, how is the photographer trying to communicate what we think is the idea here? We can dig into that. And there's more of that in the CCRS course. And we need to make sure we're asking some text-dependent questions that are worth asking. Non-text dependent questions are often good for pre-reading to build motivation and engagement. They're absolutely fine to ask students as part of a question set, but we do want to balance it with questions that ask students to go back to the text. So, yes, have you ever bought school supplies? What did you buy? That might be a great pre-reading question. But then ask questions like, who says you need a teacher in the story? This was a story, and the teacher wanted to make sure that with the dialogue, the students were clear on who said what line of dialogue. Have you ever had a conflict with someone close to you? Again, a really good general pre-reading question, but then drawing it, bringing it back to the text. What does the word plates mean? Well, a lot of students might say plates, like that you put on the table. But in this case, you're reading something about, tectonic plates, and that's very different. So draw their attention to that. Do you agree or disagree with social media having negative effects? Really good beginning question. But then we can follow up and we can ask students to use evidence from the text or the text that we've used. So the key is to have a balance. And Heather, you referred to this here when you said pointing to the evidence for lower language learners is good. It is good. And just the whole routine of locating evidence is really important for students at a more beginning English level. So these questions that get at just the basic ideas and details, where are they in the text? That's really important because they need a lot of practice with questions that they are able to answer. And they need citing evidence at beginning levels is really following instructions to find evidence, how to do it. And again, it might be pointing, it might be underlining or circling something. That's providing evidence. Do we still ask questions about students' personal connections, opinions, feelings, experiences? We absolutely do. The pendulum really swung pretty hard when the Common Core standards and the CCRs came out. Like, everything needs to be text dependent. I think we've been in this long enough to know that the answer is usually more in the middle. We need to be aware of what we're asking students to do and making sure we're asking them to do a range of thinking. And the bottom line is readers need to make text to self connections. That's really a very, very important part of something being seen as relevant. Order does matter. Order, meaning when we're doing a close reading and students are going to read a text multiple times, let's start with the general understandings or key details, the ones that are right there. Let's make sure that students have a general orientation to the text. Then we can move up. We can build some knowledge of vocabulary. We can talk about the text structure. The text structure might have a lot to do with the author's purpose or might have to do with the author's argument. We build it like a staircase. We do not need to hit every level. In fact, sometimes with my learners, we would just do a deep dive on vocabulary and we would look at figurative language in a text. We would do a read just for that, just for looking at the writer's use of certain words and choices. Heather, teaching students to be able to respond to how do you know is a useful routine. Yep, build that routine so that students get used to doing that and being able to answer how do you know. Most of the time we can start with what we have. You already have a set of questions that come with a platform or a publisher's resource. Look at the ones that are good. I want to keep these. Look at ones that maybe you just want to modify. You want to make sure that students go back to the text for that particular vocabulary word, that it's not just a general question where students could put any definition that they know down. Look at questions when you think, you know what? Actually, there's a better question worth asking. If they're gonna use their cognitive space, I want them to be answering other questions than this question. And then add, if there's something there that will push students deeper, add it to the level. Circling questions, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Mark. When we look at resources like ReadWorks, or News ELA or Common Lit, they do have text-dependent questions. And many times we can use a lot of those questions. With ReadWorks, for example, when I would use ReadWorks, it took a little extra work and I would word process a new worksheet. But usually I just resequenced the questions. They were kind of all over the place and I decided to resequence them. And we have tools on your Padlet where we have put together some suggested question stems and frames for close reading that align to the first 9 reading anchors. Many of these questions prepare students for CASAS goals and steps. It says CASAS goals and goals. That's great, Christine. CASAS goals and steps and TABE. Questions especially like which of the following words means the same as the underlined word, or which of the following words, could go into the sentence without changing the meaning of the sentence. These kind of creep up in our level gain tests. There is also another one that's included on the Padlet, and it's especially for those of you who teach level A and level B students, and it was put together by teachers who work with those levels. So some of this is not recreating the wheel. The supports are out there. And when students engage with complex text, they're having experiences with rich text, and they are finding evidence, they're talking about evidence, they're writing about evidence, they're building knowledge about a topic, about the world, about different perspectives. And that third shift is the shift of knowledge or building knowledge. And that's the last shift we're going to talk about. Let's stop here for a moment. And any questions? I'm going to stop the share here for a second. What's resonating? What's resonating with you? Like, yeah, that makes total sense. Like, this is kind of new to me, but I've already been doing that this whole time. Or what's something that you're like, oh yeah, that is something I want to do a little bit more of. What's resonating, or what questions or comments do you have? And you can unmute. When you take the CCRS course online, the self-paced course, and you complete the assignments, I give the feedback. And those of you on this call who've done the course with me, obviously I recognize you, Vonda, because it was very, very recent. I give a lot of feedback. And I give a lot of individualized feedback. I will connect you to resources, that kind of thing. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Vonda, but I know that this is a question that I ask in the course, like what's resonating, what's clicking? Was there anything you can remember that just kind of went,
As I was taking the course, and again, it was recently, just within the last few months that I finished, um, it just, and I know from working with elementary students that reading is so important. And so then when I made the jump to ESL learners, which I don't have any experience with, it just kind of drilled into me again how important reading is, but not only that is choosing appropriate reading materials, and that it isn't just going to be a book. It might be a menu. It might be reading the choices when you're going to a movie, or there's just so many opportunities in our world for reading, and I wasn't limited, I guess, and just how important all of those experiences are for my learners. I guess that was something that, I knew reading is important all along, but it just kind of reiterated that fact for me.
I love that. And that's one of the great things about, well, maybe not about the standards, but about the way that we approach the standards in Minnesota adult education. There are downsides to standards-based education, and I think we all can think of some. And we certainly don't want a one-size-fits-all education. The standards show us the outcomes we want students to reach. How we do that, what materials we use, what approaches we use, those are all up to us, and to our programs to decide. So the text we choose can have a lot to do with, especially with the kinds of activities we can do. Anybody else? Thank you so much, Vonda. Christine says, I appreciate the big picture perspective. Yep. And review how we view our daily lessons from qualitative features, scaffolding, layers of close reading. And if you are just starting with this work, pick an area, pick a shift, and go, you know what? For the next several months, I'm just really going to dig in and look at the text I'm using and at the range of text I'm using. And that's where I'm going to go. That's a huge step. That's a huge step. Or I'm going to make sure that students have more opportunities, or I get them into a routine of going back and providing evidence. That's another great step. We think in terms of small steps that have really big impact. Uh, Oh, yes, the pendulum has swung, the pendulum in education. And when you've been in education long enough, you go, the pendulum swings and you sit there and you go, all right, here we go. I'm just going to wait until it comes back to the middle. Because as we know, there is no best practice that works for everyone. There is no perfect strategy. Um, Common sense. Yep, lots of common sense. Good. Well, let's talk about building knowledge, and we can talk about backwards design. And hold on a second here. Let me make sure that too many. Hold on here. Okay. Sorry, we had a lot of fire trucks coming around here. I was just making sure they weren't at Hamlin. Okay, so think of backwards design. Think about a key takeaway. So what do you want students to, walk away with? What's that key takeaway or knowledge? And what will it take to get there? And a really good example of this is when I worked with a colleague of mine, Stephanie Summers, and she was teaching a very particular kind of paragraph. And that paragraph was a definition paragraph, and it was part of the Great Writing Series. She was working with her English learners, and they were really struggling with it. And so what she decided to do was she decided to sit down and write a definition paragraph and actually do the assignment and then stop and think about what were the skills that she needed, what was there an assumption that she knew how to do in order to write that paragraph. And then she looked back and realized there were some pieces missing that she was assuming that students had that she really needed to be more explicit about. And so, kind of thinking it's not always easy because we have programs where students are in and out, and we do have to plan for intermittent attendance. But we also often have a small core of students who are coming most of the time, and we also want to make sure to keep them moving forward as well. So, coverage versus focus. Sometimes there's a real sense of urgency to cover everything. I found that particularly doing GED prep for a long time, trying to cover everything. Like, I want them to be ready for whatever comes at them on the test. And then realizing I wasn't going to be able to do that. There was just no way. I wanted to teach them strategies to be able to figure things out if they got stuck, if they read a passage they had no background knowledge in, if they came across some vocabulary words they didn't know. I wanted to be able to give them some strategies to do that. And so I kind of slowed down a little bit. And we also need to think about what are pros and cons of a sense of urgency being a key driver of instruction. Yes, those level gains. Absolutely. We have to get those level gains. That's an important part of our funding. But where are times we need to cover and where are times we can go down a little deeper? And that's taking some time, often in ESL classes, things tend to go in themes, for example. But some essential understanding, some big questions, some literacy skills, getting students reading, writing, speaking, listening about a topic. What's going to stick? Well, again, it's balance. Some students come to our classrooms and they needed their GED yesterday and they need it to keep their job. Well, then we need to give them all we can give them in a short period of time because we have to honor the fact that they need to keep their job. A lot of students are going to be with us for a little while and we can kind of go back and forth and we can take some time to go deep in the midst of covering. That's going to be in there, but I want to get to this next part. So students need to read and write regularly about content-rich, complex texts. These are not going to be every text that you use. And what the College and Career Readiness standards say is we do need to get students reading in science. Again, that can be social science, it can be natural science, history, government, technical subject areas. Technical subject areas could be reading a movie review. It doesn't have to necessarily be technical. It could be reading about pros and cons of AI in the classroom. And often, if we're teaching at a life skills level, I've had this conversation with some beginning ESL teachers many times. How can we extend that focus? Absolutely, students need to learn vocabulary and language around things like food, transportation, housing, jobs, weather. But they're also adults and, they have interests. And we can also, pull them a little bit forward. Maybe we do a unit with food. And then maybe the piece of complex text that we're going to do it has something to do with the digestive system, or we're working with computer skills and we decide we do an activity. Maybe we look at an infographic of, some of the effects of social media on kids, but thinking about how we can kind of stretch them a little bit. And essential questions. These are open-ended. They definitely ask for debate. They usually end up with students asking more questions, and they can help us choose text and activities. I know a teacher, Erin Carey, she's with Metro North. She will do an essential question sometimes, and they will work on it a small portion of her class every week for a few weeks. So she teaches 3 hours, 2 times a week. And they're doing all kinds of things. But part of every class, they go back and they're doing something around an essential question. And here are examples of essential questions. These are either ones that I have used, or I also am an adjunct professor at Rutgers, and my adult ed teachers, these are ones they've designed instruction around. And they can be workplace safety related, healthy ways to relieve stress. One of my students was teaching a career pathway course, and her essential question was down near the bottom. How does effective communication influence professional relationships? She had a little bit higher level group. The last one there was one of my students in New Jersey who works in a prison, and she designed this unit of instruction where they read narrative stories from people who were released from prison. They looked at facts about recidivism. They looked at political cartoons. These were all GED prep students. And thinking, how will students read about, develop vocabulary about the essential question, talk about it, listen to info about it, write about it. So they're working their way through all of these strands. And a very simple level B example that I asked a teacher to create, and it's in the course, what makes people sick? And the summative task, the end goal was to use a template that she would provide to make a flyer about ways to prevent illness, and activities that she did, developing vocabulary, engaging in some close reading about preventing illness and what makes people sick. So collecting some evidence, doing some annotation with the text, which can simply be highlighting or underlining or circling, taking some time to search for images for their flyers, and then working with a partner to brainstorm ideas. I'm going to give you a more concrete example of doing something with 3 texts about the same topic. So my essential question was about cyberbullying and whose responsibility it is. What I wanted students to be able to do was to defend a position. These were GED students. I wanted them to, decide if schools, if they agreed, if they disagreed. I also gave them the option to say that there were good points on both sides. And then this is just one lesson. This was just the introduction to the topic and all the activities that I did around 3 fairly simple texts. So I have an intro slide deck, a very short video, a print text, graphics. I added those after. I'll show you. So these are my texts. I created a very easy slide deck where we talked about some key vocabulary. I made sure everybody understood cyberbullying, just the whole concept of it, make some connections. And there was some note taking for the vocabulary. Then a very short video that has absolutely no spoken language. It's really visual and it's about 3 minutes long. Or no, this one's about 5. And then moving up to a more academic text about this topic. So I built around these 3. You could do this in a couple classes, a couple lessons. Asking students to do a knowledge rating chart. So this is doing a pre-reading rather than assuming if students knew some of these keywords, asking them to evaluate themselves. I've seen this word. I know what it means. I've never seen this word before. There's a lot of good reasons to use something like this. It works really well for formative assessment. Students can go back. They can re-rate themselves. It really encourages some metacognitive thinking. This is why I give you a copy of the slide deck. I didn't state exact standards, and there are more, but I just called some out, not only for CCRS, but ACEs, because I think we forget that we're doing a lot of ACEs work, whether we know the ACEs tip or not. So the vocabulary, that's in the CCRS. Making use of background knowledge during reading and listening, that's ACEs tip. Using my intro slide deck, it's linked there. You can take a look at it. It comes with a note-taking guide. We're going to dive deep into 5 words. And we're not only going to just briefly talk about the words, I'm going to show them a sentence directly from the text, one of the texts we're going to read that uses the word, and we're going to have a little oral discussion, immediately connecting that word to their context. That oral practice is really important because later I'm going to ask them to use the words in writing. I have the pre-reading task where they're going to take some notes as we're going through the slides, and then the my turn part is going to be homework later. I have an anticipation guide if you've ever done these. Again, this is pre-reading, getting students like engaged and motivated to talk about this question. You can do 3 statements, you can do 8 statements. Make up some pretty absolute statements, and students have to decide, do I agree or disagree with this? And then after working with the text and having discussions, to go back. You can do a lot with this. You can have students talk in pairs. You can have students cite evidence for why they changed their minds. And this is, again, making use of background knowledge because they're thinking about their own opinions. They're thinking about their own experiences. You'll have access to all this. Then we're working on the second text, the short video. And we're going to watch the short video. And then I'm going to have them do a little reflection. And I'm going to give them a choice of sentence stems to write about. And then I'm going to ask them to listen to each other when they share what they connected to. And I'll show you that in a second. So the short video, again, it's even if students have low levels of language, they definitely can get feelings and ideas about what this video is about. And then I give them some agency as pick one of these. And these are ones that I used over and over again for videos. Here, students are integrating information presented in diverse media. They're thinking about central ideas or themes of a text. They're citing some evidence. You see the because. They're still making use of background knowledge. ACEs TIFF, they're identifying main ideas or themes. There's a lot going on here. And I loved giving them intentional listening activities. Not only my English learners, but my native speakers needed to learn how to listen too. So I would provide these stems because not only is this good for collaborative conversation, but they're not going to write what they don't say. They're not going to write what they don't have in their oral language. It's going to be very difficult. So starting to develop that connects to, I see it differently, in my opinion. It relates to, I agree because, and so they get to choose and they get to respond to what a classmate said. This is also really good for building community. A lot of times the students are like, wow, what you said is really cool. I didn't even, I didn't see it that way. Again, they're citing textual evidence. They're participating in a range of conversations. They're acknowledging and affirming others. That's ACEs TIFF, making use of background knowledge. This was a routine that I would use. So I would follow and I would do an anticipation guide. We'd do a background slide deck. We wouldn't do this. I would do this maybe every 6 weeks or so. We'd dive deep for a couple lessons. Then reading. I would read it out loud so they got a fluent reading. And then I would ask them to annotate any other words you're not sure of, any ideas that are confusing. We would talk about it. Students could read it aloud. So they're getting that initial fluent reading. I'm encouraging them thinking metacognitively. What are some words you don't know? Where are you getting confused? We're doing some repeated reads. We did more with this. We did more text-dependent questions. But the first couple reads, I simply said, okay, choose one of these comprehension prompts and write something very short. You can even do it orally first. Everybody, I differentiate it a little bit. Everybody had to write 2 or 3 sentences about what they thought the main idea was. And then they could choose either how it is similar to or different from something they knew, or why this information is even important for adults. And they could choose one of those. This type of low stakes writing doesn't matter if they misspell words, doesn't matter if they use the wrong verb tense. This is not about formal writing instruction. This is about writing connected with reading to deepen understanding of the text and to give them a low stakes writing experience. And it also helps us when we read what they wrote, it helps us see really quickly how they're understanding, what they're understanding, maybe what misconceptions they have. And that's CCRS, central ideas or themes, citing textual evidence, identifying main ideas when reading or listening with ACEs. So there's a ton going on here with 3 texts. And we could go on from here, or we could do some text-dependent questions, and then I can give them that, okay, so based on what we've seen, what do you think the role is of schools? And have them do a little bit of writing, a little bit of debating, and then we go on to another example. And I even thought, wow, you could add a 4th text and you could start with something like this with these images and you could do a see, think, wonder. What do you see talking about what the writer, the purpose of the cartoonist, what is the message of the cartoonist? How do we know that? What are the symbols that we see? How does it make us feel? There's so much rich discussion that can happen. And it also early on generates some good vocabulary, which is good for students who need more support, that they're being exposed to more vocabulary. So this would be a 4th text. We would call this a text set. Here's an example. I haven't done anything with this one, but here's an example of another text set. It didn't take very long for me to put it together. I found something about OSHA, which many of our students know about, what OSHA is, what OSHA does, an infographic here as another text. I was talking with a teacher the other day. I'm learning more about some free programs where you can create your own infographics like this. Pretty exciting. I'm learning more. And then the 3rd text is a story. It's a narrative text, partially a narrative text about Doris being a factory worker. We've got 3 texts here, and the goal is to build around this. How can we stay safe at work? What are some ways? What are some ways that we read about? And students can do a lot of things. They could work together. They could, create a few slides. They could do a poster. They could write about it. There's just a lot of things. These types of text sets or this work where we are exposing students to complex text, we are asking them to collect evidence or to employ evidence, and we're building knowledge around something, they don't have to take weeks and weeks and weeks. They can take a class session, 2 text class session, couple class sessions, part of 3 class sessions. I have a Padlet for you, but before that, before I drop all that information, any questions? Do you have any questions at all? Or now, like, what is one of the shifts you think you'd like to focus on more this year? Which of these shifts would you like to maybe focus a little bit more on this year, or something that you're walking away with? Again, this was a refresher. I invite you, and I will give you that information in just a moment about getting into the Canvas course. You can take it for CEUs. You can just go into it and use it as a reference. You don't have to complete the submissions. What is an ELA shift you think you'd like to focus on more this year? Look here. Go deep, not wide. Yeah, that's it. They have the same idea in math when you do CCRS math. Uncover, not cover. That's okay. I'm taking that from you. Oop. You're seeing my screen, right? It's showing me on this end that you are. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. Yes, you will have access to this recording. You will have access to the PowerPoint. Um, Continue to consider what you might want, an ELA shift you might want to work with. If you see the QR code here, you can go ahead and zap that. But if you're not a zapper, then what I'm going to do is I am going to drop a link to this Padlet in the chat box for you. And there's more on this Padlet than you probably would want, but there are lots of tools. If you want to go more into evidence and you want to add questions or tweak questions, you've got the whole set of stems and frames there. If you want to start using ATOS to see, oh, I got a text from online and I just kind of want to see where it is, the directions are there. If you want to see some videos of CCRS instruction in action, those are there. I'm actually going to click on that. Lindsay has one for the math as well. I will put a link to the recording. Your slides are right here. And what you're going to get is when you click on that, because there was so much animation, you're going to get the animated version. So don't worry about something covering something else because you're going to have access to the exact slide set that you saw. The blue book is here, the red book is here. If you're like, what do those functioning levels say? What are my students at low intermediate ABE? What are they supposed to be able to do in order to move on to the next level? It's all in here. If you're not even sure where you're at, depending on their CASAS or TABE scores, you can locate what CCRS level. There's a lot here. Pick a shift. Complexity, Padlet is great. You're welcome. But before you leave, I do have a couple quick things. And not the math refresher. I have to go through all of Lindsay's slides. We're going to end just on time here. I know sometimes that's a little fast as a refresher. So you can enroll in the course, the Foundations course. And the best place to do that will be, give me a second here. Okay, I'm just going to grab that really quick. You can go in the chat box to this link here. Second here. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this will get you, it's actually HTTPS. So if you click on that, it will take you to a page for that. You can use it as a reference. We have CCRS resources online, the YouTube channel, the Minnesota Adult Ed YouTube channel, tons of videos from your colleagues here around Minnesota. And some upcoming opportunities that I want you to be aware of. We've got Math Institute coming up November 7th, MELED, that's for K-12 adult ed, higher education, anyone working with English learners coming up in November. Questions go to Patsy. I'm running a Teaching Reading to Adults mini cohort with 4 synchronous webinars and the course. I am running that. All the information is at this link here. I'm running it with Mara Martinson, who is just a pro at working with more beginning ELs. And Language and Literacy Institute, mark your calendars, 2-day virtual. Anything and everything about language and literacy. And as always, reach out to me with any questions. If I do not know the answer, I will connect you with someone who can answer your question. That was a lot. Thank you for spending some of your afternoon with me. Thank you for the work that you're doing with adult learners. It's so important. I say now more than ever. Yep, there will be a CEU certificate. You will receive an evaluation link. And then upon completing that, you will be able to download a CEU certificate. If you have any problems with that at all, just go ahead and email me. Thank you so much, everybody.